What's better than going to the beach or a nice ride or enjoying some company with friends in July in the midst of summertime? Of course, that's listening to 7 true scary stories. So without further ado, grab a blanket, turn off your lights for 7 true horror stories that happened this month, July.
Winter coat in July. This is the story of the time I was most scared in my entire life. It's so innocuous, the things that terrified me so vague, that I'm constantly second-guessing whether I had a right to be as afraid as I was. But in terms of raw terror felt in the moment, nothing has touched this moment. This is super long, I'm sorry. I felt like I needed to get it all out of my head. I've sectioned it, so you can get right into the good part. The background. I grew up in a quaint small town. Everyone knows each other. No one locks their doors. My brother and I spent many afternoons over at my aunt and uncle's house on the other side of town, playing with our cousins and the other kids in that neighborhood. Next door lived the Morrises, who had a boy, Carl, who was my brother's age. Carl's cousin, George, was my age, and spent a lot of time over at Carl's house, so we all knew each other well. Carl had a much older brother, Christopher. He was about 10 years older than our group of neighboring kids, just graduated high school when we were around 10 years old. Christopher, as an aside, could be a Reddit Let's Not Meet story on his own, but that's a totally different story. Christopher eventually joined the army in an attempt to get his life together. When George and I were seniors in high school, Christopher was killed while deployed in Afghanistan. I felt awful for his family, even though Chris really put me off and I barely knew him. It was just an awful, tragic thing. My town is very Republican, and given the circumstances of Chris's death, the outpouring of grief took on a political charge, as it often does. Carl deeply resented the jingoistic fervor that became mixed up with his death, which made it harder for him to grieve for a brother he had a complicated and troubled relationship with. But George reacted differently. He was on the forefront of the pro-war beautification of Chris, and harbored a lot of rage, which once again I get. He lost family in a tragic, sudden way, but George was over the top. Anyone left of Ronald Reagan, anyone with the slightest misgivings about war or Muslims, and anyone sympathetic to Muslims, was personally responsible for Chris's death. It got intense. Eventually, it escalated to the point where he started to make real threats, and the administration suspended him for a week. As time went on, people dealt with their grief. The situation calmed down, the political tension faded, and things returned to normal. But not for George. The run-up. After graduation, I attended college in the nearby big city and wasn't home very often, so unfortunately, a lot of this rumors and incidents with friends from home who stayed there post-high school. My only personal run-ins are limited to Facebook screeds and getting the stink eye from him when I'm home and go to the local dive bar. He's apparently learned after his suspension to keep his anti-pacifist crusade under wraps, but there's been a pattern of vandalism directed at liberals and pacifists. Cars keyed, tires slashed, bumper stickers scraped off. During the first Obama campaign in '08, someone went around town in the dark of night and defaced or destroyed every Obama yard sign in about a 2-mile radius. Every Obama yard sign. No one's caught him, but everyone's sure George is behind it. He's so angry, the other angry conservatives think he's a little bit out of his mind. I don't want to give the impression he's unmitigated crazy. Shockingly, he's a fairly normal guy, has a good job where he makes good money, and was regarded as doing good work, volunteers, has a long-term girlfriend for a while. He's also known for getting angry drunk at the bar and shouting at people. They've had to remove him a couple times. In the biggest incident, 6 to 7 months before my run-in, George assaulted a guy called Sparky. Christopher had been Sparky's closest friend before he died. Sparky had gone in the opposite direction of George. He was now an outspoken anti-war liberal, and has been running his mouth about how Bush had killed his best friend when George decided to beat him into the ground. Cops were called, George was hauled off, but Sparky did not press charges. The incident. My hometown's pretty right-leaning, but there's a solid, if small, liberal Democrat scene too. The liberal people like to hold these mini rallies in the park on the main street. I call them rallies because they're really politically themed family picnics, not actual rallies. Just like 20 to 30 people in a park with slogan t-shirts and signs, sitting around eating sandwiches and shooting the shit and playing with dogs. My husband and I were staying in my parents' house this past summer while we were prepping to move overseas. I really wanted to see everyone before I left, because I didn't know when I'll be back, and when hippy-dippy neighbor told me that there was a rally at the park that afternoon, I decided to go. The rally was great. It was perfect if hot weather. Mid-July, sunny, just wonderful. I was having a catch-up with a high school friend I hadn't seen in years, Melissa, who happens to be the aforementioned Sparky's little sister. She had been doing quite well, got married to a lovely guy, had her first kid. After a while, the baby wants to nurse. So, as Melissa's situating him, I take a glance around the area, and my eyes land on George. My heart starts thumping, and every hair on my neck goes up. I don't even know why. He's just leaning against his car door, parked on the opposite side of the street, maybe 15 feet down, smoking a cigarette, and fucking around on his phone. But I'm panicking. Then I notice it. It's July. Not a cloud in the sky. Easily 90 degrees in the sun, and he's wearing a long, thick winter jacket. It's just so incongruent. All these people in shorts going for ice cream, and he's just for January wind? Why? Why is he wearing that jacket? And why is it making me want to call 911 immediately? After a few minutes of trying to ignore the klaxons going off in my brain, I notice that he's glowering in the direction of the protest. When he notices me looking, he looks back at his phone. He finishes a cigarette, lights another one. His hands are starting to shake, and the sounds of friendly clatter around me grow distant. I don't know what to do, but something had to be done. I smiled big and waved. I yelled out, "Hey, George!" His head snaps up. I wave and smile again. "George, come on over!" I wave him over. He gets on his feet, unsure. Take a couple steps in my direction, hesitates, and then slowly he walks over to me. Hey. Hey, how you been? It's been so long. I feel worried that my feigned friendliness is too exaggerated. Oh yeah, good. So, I hear you got this sick new gig now, how's that? Good. We continue like this. I'm putting my best friendly smile. I'm pulling out my best small talk, the weather, my move, local news, his job, childhood good times. I cross my arms over my chest so he won't notice my hands are shaking. He answers in grunts and monosyllables. He seemed crazy nervous, shifting from foot to foot. Eyes keep darting to his car, to the people around him, and back. He keeps... This was the creepiest, most horrifying part. Unconsciously touching his chest, like he's making sure something is still there. At one point, I went to hug him, and he pulled back so fast, you'd think I was covered in shit. After about 5 minutes, but it seemed like an hour, he blurts out abruptly, "I gotta run, bye." It was the most syllables he's uttered in the whole conversation. He turns, speed walks to his car, jumps inside, and speeds away. I sigh with relief, and turn back to Melissa, who's finishing up nursing. I asked if she saw that, and was as freaked out by it as I was. Yep, she says. So I asked to talk to her privately about it. She hands off the baby to her husband, and we go to a quiet corner of the park. I start rambling out the story, just to get them out of my head and get a little validation from someone else. Was he really that creepy in that coat? Should I have been as alarmed and as terrified as I was? As soon as I mentioned him touching something inside his jacket, she sits down on the ground and burst into tears. Through her sobs, part relief, part panic, she tells me that last night, Her brother Sparky had received a phone call from George out of nowhere. They obviously hadn't been friendly for a while. George had seemed hurried, a little frantic, clearly had something on his mind. But all he had told Sparky was that he should, under no circumstances, go to the rally the next day, and that he should tell Melissa to stay away too. He wouldn't explain and hung up. Sparky had decided not to go, but Melissa thought it was just George being George, and went anyways. Both Melissa and I went home after that. What the fuck, guys? I know George owns a gun or two. Shooting and hunting is a pretty popular hobby where I'm from, and it's pretty common to own a gun and know how to use it. Did I foil a mass shooting attempt? What happened here? It just couldn't be, could it? I just know that I've never felt like I was in more danger in my entire life. I have not heard anything from or about George since. July 4th creeper wants a taste of 13-year-old girls. My grandparents are big holiday people. We split up our holidays. What I meant by that is we alternate where we go each holiday. They come down for Easter, we go to Michigan for 4th of July. They come down for Thanksgiving, we go up for Christmas. The next year, we go up for Easter, they come down for 4th of July. We go up for Thanksgiving, they come down for Christmas. Well, the summer before my freshman year of high school, I was a month shy of turning 14. We went to my grandparents for the 4th of July. They had a huge day planned, starting with t-shirt making, followed by a cookout at their church, finished off by a night of fireworks downtown. Their church was located just behind a playground park, so the main cookout area was set up there for the younger kids. This particular year, my best friend Lexi accompanied my family up to Michigan. Anyways, my uncle and grandpa went on a little walk around the park, and my dad was in one of the park pavilions with my mom, while Lexi and I went to play on the monkey bars. Quite literally out of nowhere, this old man comes up to us and starts chatting us up. "Nice day for a picnic, isn't it?" I shrugged, but Lexi continued to strike up a conversation with the dude. She's always been the more social one. "Oh yeah, it's a little hot for my taste," she said. The guy looked her and I both up and down, and I swear he licked his lips as he said, "That's not the only thing hot around here." Freaking out, I glance around the park to try to find my 6'6", 300-pound uncle to scare the creeper away. He was all the way on the other side of the park. My dad, apparently seeing the guy and my expression, came over. He's not as big as my uncle, but just as formidable. "Hey man, maybe you should leave them alone," he said. "I'm just making conversation," the old guy told him. "Yeah, I get that, but I'd really prefer if you didn't make conversation with my two 13-year-old daughters." "Nah, relax, dude. I wasn't gonna do anything to them." "Look, I really hate to involve anyone else in this." He started reaching for a cell phone in his pocket. "Leave them alone, okay?" My grandmother came over at this point and started saying basically the same stuff. This might sound funny, but my dad's mom is one badass old lady. She's stronger than any old lady I'd ever seen. And she's got energy out the wazoo. To top it all off, she can scream and holler like nobody's business and make you feel about 6 inches tall in about 30 seconds. "Relax," the old guy said. "We're all children of God in God's house. I was just trying to enjoy his spirit and talk to these girls. I wasn't gonna do anything." Finally, my uncle came back from his walk, and my dad called for him. When the old guy saw the size of my uncle, he held up his hands, muttered an apology, and took off before anyone could say another word. Some dude hid under my beach chair. Last year in July, I was on vacation in Sicily for 10 days. I was having an awesome time. My hotel was right on the beach, and you could walk through the pool area down to the beach, where a portion of it was sectioned off for hotel guests. There are many beach lounge chairs, with little tables and umbrellas that you could use. I got a chair and put up my umbrella and decided to read. There was an older couple a few chairs down from me, but no one else was on the chairs that day, though the rest of the beach was packed. I was lying down just relaxing, and I put my book down and closed my eyes. I wasn't worried about theft, as I had nothing with me except a towel and my book, and I felt safe. I fell asleep, and I think I was asleep for around an hour and a half. I woke up and was going to get up to go down the water edge. When I stepped off the chair, I stepped on something and I heard a noise. I kind of screamed as it startled me, and it was someone's hand that I stepped on. All of a sudden, some guy just wriggles out from under my chair and runs down the beach to the left at full speed. I was so surprised, and I didn't really react other than my scream, because I was a bit woozy and had just woken up. I didn't see his face, but he had very tan skin and was wearing board shorts and a t-shirt. I don't know how long he was under my chair for, and obviously no one told me that there was some dude under my chair. Weird guy. Let's not meet. Stranger on my sofa. This happened July 2016, about a week after my 18th birthday. For some context, I'm a 5'1" female, and I live in a small, close-knit town with my dad and 14-year-old sister. My dad always left for work at 7 a.m. and never found it necessary to lock the door behind him, since day had already been broken at this point. Being a jobless teenager off school for the summertime, I would stay up all night on my laptop and sleep all the next day, which my sister would also do. On this particular day, I woke up at 4 p.m., which I'm not proud of, but I was still awake before my sister was. I live in a single-story house, and my bedroom is at the very far end of it. I got up and walked down the hall to the kitchen to get something to eat. The house is shaped somewhat like a capital T, with the living room and kitchen beside each other at the top. From the journey to the kitchen, you can see into the living room with a full view of the sofa on the far end of the room. On the way, I glanced into the living room and saw a man I did not recognize lying on his back asleep on my couch. I stopped dead in my tracks, but my mind didn't immediately go to Intruder. I stood there and texted my dad, asking, did he let one of his friends crash on our couch? Then I backtracked a few steps down the hall and into my sister's room, woke her up, and told her about the man. She was more worried than I was and texted my dad also, and would not leave her room to take a look at the man. I went back into the hall to look at him, and because I'm a dumb teenager who documents everything for Twitter, I took a picture of him. Then I retreated back to my room to wait for my dad to reply. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, not very worried, when my sister texted me something along the lines of, "Come to my room right now." She held her phone to my face, and a text from my dad to her read, "I've called the police. Get out of the house now." This is when I start to freak out. There are 2 doors to leave my house. Unfortunately, one is in the hall by the living room, and the other is through the kitchen, meaning either way, we'd have to walk past the man. We opted to climb out my bedroom window instead, which wasn't an issue, since the house was a single story, but in my panic, I managed to tear down a number of my blinds and caused a lot of noise, which only made me panic more. We both ran across the street to our neighbor's house, who were friendly with my dad, but I'd never actually spoken to them. We explained the situation, and they took us into the living room, and the wife stationed her husband at their front door to watch our house, in case the intruder tried to leave. The police took 20 minutes to arrive. My dad had already left work and got home before they got there. It turns out the man was very high on drugs and had wandered into our unlocked house at some point during the morning and decided to nap on our couch. The police could barely rouse him into consciousness and dragged him out to their car to take him away, although they did let my dad speak to the man first, and he told them off for scaring us, but decided not to press charges. I doubt the man heard what he said anyways. The police did come back later to ask us a few questions. It only took a few minutes, and they left promising we'd receive an apology letter from the intruder, which we never did. I'm just so happy that nobody was hurt, and that he decided to sleep on the couch instead of wandering into someone's bedroom to sleep. So I live in the barracks. Safe, right? So, this happened in early July, and it still creeps me out a bit today. I'm a soldier and live in the barracks on base. Since I'm not married and can't really afford my own place, for security reasons, I will not name the base or its location. It is typically pretty quiet around here, aside from the common parties that happen on the weekends, so this event was pretty surprising to me. Additionally, I work the night shift 4 days a week, from 2 to midnight, so it's even quieter on most days when I return to my room. This night, however, was on 4th of July weekend. Military gets a 4-day weekend on federal holidays, so the common area was a bit louder on Thursday night, my last workday for the week when I got back. To give you a better idea about the layout, the barracks are separated into 4 3-story buildings that share a large concrete common area. Since we obviously can't smoke in our rooms, the common areas have 2 smoking areas. We call them smoke pits on either side. The pits each consist of a picnic table, a grill, and a large trash bin covered by an awning to block out the rain. The pits are the site of most of the parties that occur on the weekends, mainly the one furthest from my building. I had gotten out work early, so it was about 10 when I got to the barracks and made my way to my room. As per usual, on the nights that don't have workdays following them, there was a party at the pit furthest from my building, where most of the people outside were at. However, there was one person at my building's pit. Originally, I assumed he was just there to smoke and wasn't up for the partying. What was stranger, however, was that he had no lit cigarette, no vape, and wasn't on his phone. He just sat there, dressed in blue jeans and a red hoodie without his hood up. It was the middle of July in the south, so this was a bit strange, but the rooms are pretty much perpetually cold during the summer, so I figured he might have just stepped out to warm up. He sat on the table with his arms in his front pocket and his head hanging, wanting to smoke. I stood at the opposite side of the table and lit a cigarette. The guy didn't speak or even move for the entire time I was there. He just sat there, blankly, staring into his lap. I didn't think much of it and just made my way to my room, changed, and just patrolled YouTube for a while. It's important to note a few things here. Each room houses 2 soldiers, and the doors automatically lock when closed. The only people with the keys are the unit headquarters, and the room's residents themselves. In the event that a resident loses their key, they have to call to get someone to unlock it every time they need to get into the room, until the key is replaced. Additionally, my room is located on the 2nd floor of the building, and is a bit tucked away around the back, so unlike the rest of the building, there is next to no traffic outside of my room. Lastly, my side of the room has the only window that is where the door is, so I can hear when someone rarely passes my room. Finally, my roommate worked an odd shift from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., and I wasn't too sure what days he worked. Also, the room is very dark, and I cannot see if my roommate is asleep in the room when I first enter, so I close the door quietly by keeping the knob turned as it closes. This is important. He wasn't home at this time. At around 2 a.m., I hunkered down to get some sleep. Before I dozed off, however, I could hear a shuffling outside. I peeked out the window and could see some obviously inebriated girl tripping over herself to get to her room. I knew the girl lived in the room next to mine, so I didn't see a need to help her since she was literally right there. But I listened for a while, until I heard her enter her room. About 10 minutes later, I heard someone walking towards my door and stop. I figured it was my roommate getting home, but I couldn't hear the obvious sounds of someone unlocking the door. For a long moment, it was silent. Then, I heard the sound of my door slowly opening. Instantly, I sat up and looked at the foot of my bed where the door was. There was no sound of the doorknob turning, and no click of the lock. The door was just slowly being pushed open, as if someone was trying to enter very quietly, which wasn't like my roommate. After the door was fully open, someone not in uniform walked in. At first, I didn't recognize who it was, until I noticed a red hoodie. I gasped and screamed, "Get the fuck out!" The man jumped and darted out of the room. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door. but by the time I made it, the guy had jumped over the rail and onto the bushes below and was running across the common area. Immediately, I called the MPs and they arrived within minutes. A few of them did a search of the area, while the rest made trips around the rooms to check on everybody. The girl's room next to mine was also not closed. They eventually found the guy in a storage room of another one of the barracks buildings. A few weeks passed until I found out the whole story. Apparently, the guy wasn't even a soldier, but was an ex of the girl who lived next to me. Prior to that night, the ex didn't know what room she lived in and had attempted to follow her to her room after she had finished partying. He knew she did not have a roommate at the time, so he figured he'd been able to prey on her without anyone noticing. I don't know how the guy got onto base, since there's always ID checks at the gate, and the guy didn't even have identification on him. Fortunately for the girl, in my attempt to be quiet, I had accidentally not closed my door completely, and the guy mistook my room for hers. What's worse is that the girl had not closed her door all the way either, so had the guy not mixed up the rooms, he'd have broken into hers while she was extremely drunk and likely unconscious. While I am fortunate that the girl was safe, I fear for what might have happened had I been asleep when that creep was in my room. Typically, the barracks are supposed to be safe places for troops to sleep, and things of this nature don't typically happen, but this goes to show you that you need to be careful no matter where you are. So, creepy civilian in the red hoodie, let's not meet again. The Silent Shadow Meets My Imaginary Father. It was a sweltering afternoon in mid-July 1995. I had spent my day submerged within the watery heaven of the pool at my apartment complex. Despite being grounded at the time, my mother was at work, and the Oklahoma temperatures had reached around 100 that day. So, 13-year-old me decided that certain chances had to be taken. I was stubborn, but I was also terrified of my mother at that age. I made a plan to take a shower, dry my hair, and change back into my clothes before she returned home at 5 that evening to avoid being caught. At 3:30, I gathered up my towel and my sandals and headed back to my apartment. My brother and I had just been stripped of our house keys for one reason or another, but we had an agreement to leave the sliding glass door unlocked so that we each had free access. We lived within a row of townhouses, and our sliding door was located right next to our neighbor's front door. Patty was the mother of my brother's best friend, Mark, and was always home, so we thought it'd be a fail-proof system and felt safe about the decision. I headed inside my empty apartment and ran upstairs to hide my towel and swimsuit in the back of my closet, and then raced into the bathroom for a quick shower. As I was getting out, I realized that I had accidentally left my clothes on my bed. Cursing myself, I wrapped a towel around my body and opened the bathroom door to head across the hall and get dressed. I was in mid-stride when I heard the distinctive sound of the sliding glass door opening slowly, followed by the light rattling of the vertical blinds that covered it. Then, nothing but silence. My brother's habit was to call out when he got home, and he never in his life entered that door more discreetly than a drunken moose would have. I knew immediately that something was off, and froze in place in the hallway. I was literally 3 steps away from my safety of my bedroom, but too terrified to move. My mind began to race, my breath caught in my throat, and every hair in my body stood on end. It felt like hours, but mere seconds had passed. Then, a tall shadow moved slowly across the hall towards the living room, and suddenly my mind was not my own. With seemingly a foreign voice, I shouted out of nowhere, "Dad, I think Calvin just got home. Are y'all going to the game?" And then watched as the shadow quickly changed direction. I heard the glass door slam open violently as the vertical blinds crashed and swung in protest. I took that moment as an opportunity to sprint into my mother's room and grab the baseball bat that she kept by her bed. Feeling that I was now securely armed, I stealthily made my way downstairs. I found the living room empty. and as I turned towards the now deserted dining room, I could see that the patio door stood wide open and the blinds were swinging crazily along their track. I swung the bat out through the blinds into open air, just in case, and then swiftly slammed the door shut and locked it. Feeling a bit more brave, I crept around the house and checked every room and every closet, with my trusty bat at ready to catch a home run off any lingering creeper's head. Luckily, I found nothing but empty space, and enough time to throw some clothes on and dry my hair before the real terror arrived, in the form of my mother, finding out I had disobeyed her and spent my day in the sun instead of in prison within the apartment like a good girl. I never told her what happened, but I did thoroughly interrogate my younger brother later that evening, when I was sent to fetch him home for dinner. He had been playing Sega all day with his friend Ryan, and was freaked out by my questions, swearing that it wasn't him. I realized that he was telling the truth, and felt bad for scaring him, so I told him not to worry, that it was probably just a friend of mine being stupid. Needless to say, I spent the rest of my punishment that week inside, behind locked doors. My mother returned our keys that weekend, and I never again had to scold Calvin about forgetting to lock the front door. A week later, a guy was arrested for breaking into an apartment 2 buildings down. The tenant came home early and caught him. He had jimmied the locks on the glass door to get inside. Since the perpetrator never returned, I figured it was the same guy. By sheer luck, I'm no spring chicken now, but the UK during the 1980s was a different time. Children would be out all day and into the evening, playing from very young traffic, and was not seen as much of a risk as now. And the strangers lurking around corners were the normal tales used to get kids to head home when the street lamps came on. I was a fairly mature-minded child, living in Scotland, in a normal council estate area. At 7 years old, I used to walk the dog, which is what I did on one summer evening in 1983. It was still quite light, and I was walking the dog, who had, as normal, ran off. She was a cross-collie type dog, so ran fast. I used to walk her around a park which was surrounded by a fairly isolated wooded area. I wandered through there. It was something I used to do each night, holding Sheila the dog's leash, humming away. Went up ahead. About a couple minutes away, I noticed a man standing. He looked like he was in pain and was bent at the waist slightly. I stopped in the path, and he looked up at me, said hello. I was a normal 7-year-old, replied, but stayed a bit away from him, which is when he asked my name, what I was doing in the park alone, etc. As kids, you are told to do what adults say, so I was answering him. As I talked, he edged closer and closer to me. He seemed like a giant, as most people do at that age. I remember thinking how his eyes were a bright blue color. He had some glasses on, and looked a bit dirty and scruffy, with a beard like my dad had when he hadn't showered for a couple days. We stood for a while in the woods, talking about where my dog could be, and he said he would help me find her. I could hear my mom shouting me for dinner time, and I was getting worried if I would get smacked for being late. He took my hand and started walking through the park with me, and I remember seeing a van on the road and starting to get worried. I tried to pull my hand away out of his, but he held on, crushing my fingers together. I remember his face looked dark. His eyes had gone very small, they looked black, and he was breathing heavily. He smelled really bad, like metal and something dirty. I froze. I remember feeling just petrified and wetting myself, not knowing what was happening, but that something bad was going to happen to me. I was too frightened to scream. I heard my mom call my name again, and I couldn't answer. Suddenly, Sheila dashed out of the trees, straight into the man, and bit him on the leg or waist. I got up and ran out of the park, leaving the man shouting and the dog barking. My house was the last house on the street next to the park, so it was only a couple of minutes. I got home, and my dad, after getting a bit of sense out of me, ran out into the street. The van was still there, the dog still barking. He ran into the trees, and it seemed the man ran past him into the van and drove away, never to be seen or heard of again. My dad came back with the dog, and that night, I got sent to bed with a smack for speaking to strangers, and it was never mentioned again. For ages, I was terrified of going anywhere alone. Nightmares. Dreamt that he would be at my window, trying to take me away. But eventually, it all faded away into one of those memories. Then, a few years back, I was watching some sort of TV documentary where a case was shown about the child murderer Robert Black, who killed 3 little girls during various points in the 1980s. I immediately recognized him as the man who was in the woods. I would never forget those eyes he had, either before or after me seeing him in the woods. Sadly, my parents are not around to say when exactly this happened, what month it was, as I'm almost definite that it was in July. I often think that it may have happened before he kidnapped a young girl from a fairground and murdered her. Maybe he might have been able to have been stopped. Or I might have never been seen again. Either way, he is dead now according to the news, so no chance of meeting him again.